Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, good morning still. Um, Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a distinguished panel here that is really eager to talk to you about the current trends in ethical fashion and the trends that the industry is seeing both in the United States and worldwide. And it is important for us to try to understand what these trends are because the term has been used pretty broadly. And right now, with what our panelists are going to describe, it can have really different implications throughout the entire process of either production of different garments from an academic standpoint, from an investor standpoint. So we are really happy to have them all today. We have with us Christian Berkey. He is a social entrepreneur. He graduated from Princeton University in 2013. And he went, actually his story is interesting, super interesting. We're gonna talk more about that. He went from studying and being concerned about the American incarceration crisis that the country is living right now to creating his own fashion line under the name of Laslo. He is a really strong advocate for socially conscious fashion, socially conscious clothing. And for him, it's not only about the product. It's not only about the t-shirt, for example, that you can see that someone's wearing. For him, it has a different meaning. And I quote, for him, it's also about building a business model that, in a way, can show and can say that the way in which we consume is broken, that the way in which we produce is broken, and that we have to think about different alternatives in which we can get involved and actually improve the communities in which we are involved in. So thank you so much for being here with us, Christian, today. We also have Spandana Singh. Spandana Singh is a co-founder of a company called Zero Corporation. Zero Corporation is an apparel firm that tries to connect emerging designers in the United States with artisans in Mexico, India, and Indonesia in order for them to be able to cater to a high-end market in the United States to showcase their textiles, and who has a really interesting value proposition. Before co-founding Zero Corporation, she worked with UNICEF, she worked with the World Bank in developing programs and initiatives for small and medium enterprises, as well as initiatives for gender equality and supply chain management. She also sits on the board of Ask Ms. A, which is a digital publication in the intersection of technology, entrepreneurship, beauty, and fashion. And last but definitely not least, we have Dr. James Gifford, who is the director of Impact Strategy of Town Investment Management, a private equity firm that tries to improve and aims to improve the way in which companies, apparel manufacturing companies, operate both in a sustainable manner and in a profitable manner in Southeast Asia. He's also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School for the initiative of responsible investment, and he's also the author of the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment, which right now have more than 1,200 signatories and that represent more than 30 trillion in assets. So thank you so much, James, Spandy, and Christine for being here. Just to begin this panel, we want to know a bit more about your guys' background more in depth, and just to start with you, for example, Christian, can you please tell us more about what is the business model that Laslo has been carrying out? Why do you focus in the U.S.? What is your mission, your vision, and how do you see this fitting into the ethical fashion space?
Yeah, so I guess what we're doing is trying to take a really simple item and talk about some very complex issues. So my background is in social and environmental justice work. I've been involved in that my whole life, and at some point in college I realized that despite the fact that I started my first social enterprise at age 10, I had a closet filled with stuff made by widely exploited children in Bangladesh and Vietnam, and there was this disconnect between how I was trying to live and what I was wearing. And at first I thought that I just wasn't looking in the right places, and then I realized that I felt really guilty about what I was wearing and couldn't find anything that I didn't feel that guilty about. And then I thought that perhaps it was a design problem. Maybe there were things that were on the market that were sustainable and ethical, but I didn't want to wear because I didn't like how they were designed. And I've kind of gone down this rabbit hole of what does it look like to make clothing in a way that creates as much good as possible. So I first committed to being in Detroit, then committed to doing sustainable fashion, and then realized that the Department of Corrections was hiring men or training men to sew while they were in prison. So they make inmate uniforms and guard uniforms. And with my background in prison policy, I was like, all right, obviously we're going to do things sustainably, but this is also an opportunity to tell a story about a really significant issue in this country, which is incarceration, and to create jobs for a population that really has a hard time finding employment, but was coming with a skill set that we really needed. So we see it as a win-win, not necessarily as going out and doing something above and beyond. I don't know if that answers the question. But
No, definitely, definitely. So you've been with this initiative right now for a period of 3 years then?
Yeah, so I've been working on it in various capacities for 3 years. We set up a manufacturing space after raising some money last summer. We're in Detroit. We have a very small team. It's 4 of us. One guy who went through who's a previously incarcerated, who's doing some sewing for us. And we started with a very simple item, the white t-shirt, as kind of a project that everyone wears, that we can do most of the learning that we need to do. We've done everything from custom develop the highest quality organic cotton fabric in the world, grown in California, spun in Georgia, knit in California, to learning from master indigo dyers that have traveled around the world. So really trying to say at each step in the process, what's the best way to do this? Whether it's design and saying, how can we design something that looks good now, but also looks good 10 years down the road, or where we're sourcing, or who we're hiring, or where we're making it.
No, definitely. That's really interesting. And later on, we're going to get into the topic of how do you plan to build this as a sustainable and scalable model, especially if you still try to target the former incarcerated population later on. James, you authored, as previously noted, you authored the Principles for Responsible Investment initiative that is also backed by the United Nations. And we were wondering if you could let us know a bit more about how can you reconcile your experience by building this framework on one side and your current experience with working with Tao in the manufacturing apparel industry in Southeast Asia.
Sure, thank you. So my background was on sustainable investing, and I did my PhD on shareholder activism and how can large investors like pension funds and fund managers really use their power as investors to push companies to be more sustainable. And what started me into the sustainable fashion and apparel space was one of my case studies in my PhD on shareholder activism was the shareholder activism on Gap between 2000 and 2004. And I studied all of the interactions between the activist shareholders who were filing shareholder resolutions on Gap and the management and the sustainability people at Gap. And funnily enough, I've since become friends with the people who were on the other end of those investor activism. And their view of this activism is, this is brilliant because suddenly shareholders are demanding that we become a more sustainable company, and that gave the sustainability champions within the firm more legitimacy and credibility to then be able to have that discussion with sourcing to say, hey, even our shareholders are demanding we do more on this. The end result of the shareholder activism on Gap was the first ever audited, third-party audited supply chain report, which dug right deep. And it came out about 2004, and it was horrendous reading. It was terrible. They found all kinds of abuse in the supply chain, but rather than being criticized, the NGO community was like, at last, well, apart from Nike, at last somebody, a large apparel firm, has actually been honest about what's going on in the supply chain. And, despite what you might see on John Oliver and so on, I actually think Gap is doing a good job. And I think they are trying really hard. It's absolutely impossible to eliminate all abuse and all dodgy things from large factories. But what I would argue is that factories that are pretty good, or the top 10% of factories in Bangladesh, for example, are overwhelmingly the better option from the next best, working in a brick factory or in a rice field or whatever it might be. I personally believe that the best factories, the ones that H&M are using, and Gap and Marks and Spencer and Patagonia and Levi's, these aren't places I would personally like to work for 11 hours a day. because it's boring, but they're clean, people get paid on time. There are always going to be abusive bosses. I've suffered them myself in the United Nations, so you don't have to be in a garment factory to have an abusive boss. There's always going to be terrible places to work and terrible people to work with. But these factories have the potential to be one of the greatest forces for good in humanity. And I would argue that the apparel industry has historically been one of the greatest forces for good in the United States 100 years ago. Dodgy sweatshops, but my God, it brought this country out, millions of people, unskilled labor, out of poverty. You look at what happened in Korea after the Korean War. Dodgy sweatshops, sure, but my God, did that industry bring that country out of poverty and allow them to build up the management capacity to go make cars and go make transistor radios and so on? The same is happening in China. Yes, it started with dodgy sweatshops, but look, the wages go up, the expertise goes up, and now they're making iPhones and wages are significantly higher. And the same's happening in Bangladesh. So I would argue before people, I guess, demonize and jump on this sort of populist, everything's bad in countries like Bangladesh, actually, no, it's not. Yes, there are many dodgy factories, but there are also some really good factories, and what we're trying to do with Tau Investment Management is invest in those factories that are maybe not quite there yet and bring them up to fair trade standards and make them much more efficient and profitable and really make money at the same time as delivering a safe and respectable workplace for thousands of workers.
Can I just chime in on one thing about the garment industry? I like a lot what you said. I also know that the garment industry was the main driver of slavery, the legacy of which we're still dealing with. Not that I disagree with what you said, but like in the context of the industry, we have a rich history of really despicable things coming out of fashion.
Yeah, so there's definitely a room for improvement there. And our third panelist here, Spandana Singh, please, if you can just let us know a bit more about what Sierra Corporation actually does, because I think that there's way more than what I described before. And in a way, how do you see as an entrepreneur that has bootstrapped this, how do you see the ethical fashion space changing, and in the way that how startups have a role in changing the ethical fashion industry, or just big conglomerates leveraging their own networks? Which ones are more important? Which ones are more predominant? And which ones can actually enact change?
Thank you. So a bit about what Sierra does. My co-founder and I actually came up with the idea when we were in Tulum in Mexico, and we saw these artisans who produce amazingly beautiful clothing, but the ways in which they were produced, both of us looked at them and said, we could never wear this because the way that where we live defines our preferences, and those kind of clothes are very unique to where they're being sold. So we talked to the artisans a bit, and we learned a bit more about their production process, and they are very high quality forms of textiles and fabrics being produced in India, Mexico, and Indonesia. And so we've decided that we would source the fabrics for them, so we would still provide them with demand and help them to sustain their production methods and their livelihoods. But we would also work with emerging designers in the United States who have their own problems. Fashion is a very competitive industry. It has one of the lowest turnover rates in the United States, and it's a very, very competitive industry, and it's hard for them to break into it and become a successful designer. So we bring together these two communities and help them create mutual value. So the designers adapt the textiles and fabrics, and we as Sierra sell them to a high-end consumer, and we use the company as a way of sustaining the demand of the textiles and fabrics. And to your second question, I think that in order for fashion to really transcend and really become a completely ethical industry, you can't choose between the startups or the large companies. The startups have really been heralded for bringing in these ideas of sustainability, fair wages, fair trade, and so on. And some, as James mentioned, some companies have really taken up these ideas. But if you want to really transcend the entire industry, you need to have a proper partnership between both sides.
Definitely. And with you, Christian, there's this current topic, and there's a current topic in the ethical fashion space about how it is really important to learn how to educate the consumer in order for the consumer to actually support not only the initiative, but to make the initiative itself sustainable. So how do you believe that brands themselves, for example, you with Laslo, can nudge your customers in the right direction in order to not only buy a product once, but to believe in the brand and to actually grow it as a part of the space?
Probably starts with being honest, and honestly, we haven't figured it out.
Okay.
I think the challenge for us is moving beyond what I think a lot of companies in this space have done, which is recognizing that there are a lot of abuses and issues, and figuring out how can we get beyond this model of either guilt or charity to a point where we realize that it's a whole lot more exciting to buy something when you recognize that it's making a difference in someone else's life, and that you also, well, maybe first you feel great about putting it on because it looks good, and then also, you're making a big difference in someone else's life. I think as we move forward, it's going to come from, getting to a point where we have a more meaningful relationship with stuff, right? Where material goods in our lives are not the source of happiness, but they add to our happiness. There are a lot of things in life that are a whole lot more important than the clothing that we're wearing, but if we do it right, the purchases that we make can be, a force for good, and therefore, hopefully, a source of meaning for us. So for Laslo, it's really trying to figure out how we tell these stories in a way that we're moving towards something exciting, not just avoiding something that's really negative.
Okay, definitely. And trying to link this up with the following question for you, James. How, in a way, there is not enough, but a growing demand and a growing offer of firms and entrepreneurs that are interested in the space and are seeing value in exploiting the space. But do you actually see it from an investor's perspective? Do you see that the space is underinvested? And if so, why do you see it?
So investment is a very broad area. You have, like I said, the listed equities doing the shareholder activism, which most people don't even think of when they think of investment into sustainable fashion. But all of you have probably pension funds that it's your money sitting somewhere, and that money could be invested in pension funds that are actually doing activism to push these large companies to improve. So that would be the first thing I'd suggest is, who is your pension fund or your 401k or your mutual fund, and where are they investing, and are they doing any shareholder activism on this? And if it's a big one, the chances are it's not. So there are certainly more sustainable and activist options for your own pensions that can really help. And As You Sow is one NGO that's here at the conference who's doing fantastic work on yarn sourcing. They've just launched a new project, yarn ethically sourced, and they're going from all directions, both on the working with the big brands, but also with the shareholder activists. Then you move to the private equity, which is what Tao is doing, and private debt. There are some efforts to get debt funds in. That's still pretty small, I'd have to say. There's not many people operating at that mid-level investment piece. And then there's the VC, the types of people who would be investing in these guys' companies. It's also pretty small, and I'd say it's similar to other sustainability VC type investors. There's some organizations like the Cordes Foundation, and Steph Cordes was going to be on this panel, but unfortunately couldn't, who is really dedicated to sustainable fashion and apparel and women's empowerment. And so they've been at SOCAP as well. So there's a smaller number, but it's absolutely increasing. I've been doing more speaking to next-gen ultra-high net worth audiences about sustainable fashion and really showing them the spectrum of investment opportunities.
And just a follow-up question for that, is there anything in the entrepreneur's hands that they can do to actually convince investors or attract more investors into this arena?
So, a couple of points. There's an increasingly accepted view, I believe, amongst ethical fashion people, and I'd love to have your guys' take, in that maybe 5 or 8 years ago, you could produce an organic T-shirt and make it, this is organic and fair trade and so on, and people would buy it because it's organic and fair trade, and it doesn't really matter that it doesn't quite fit or it's not so cool. I think what's happened in the last few years is the ethical and sustainable apparel design community has recognized we cannot sell this stuff on the basis that it is sustainable and ethical. It has to be beautiful and designed really well, and it has to be just like the Tesla. It's a great example, you know. Tesla didn't produce a dinky little smart car looking vehicle to start with, right, and say this is the greenest vehicle ever. It kind of goes slow, but it's really sustainable, right? They're like, we're going to build the best car in the world, period. It's going to be super expensive and really nice, and it's just going to kick everyone's ass. And then they introduce a $30,000 car a few years later. The ethical fashion industry has to recognize that it has to be the absolute best in terms of design and coolness and hipness, and, you know, it has to be embedded in people who watch Project Runway, and, you know, so this is a real change, I think, from 5 years ago, where the sustainability and the ethics was sort of driving the marketing. Now it's like, we have got the most beautiful garments you could imagine, and you're going to just look so hot in them. And then, you know, by the way, it's also fair trade and sustainable. Same goes for investment, right? Nobody wants to sacrifice returns to do good in the world. Well, some investments are, but less than a third of impact investments are kind of deliberately targeting lower than market returns. Everyone believes that, you know, if the product is good enough, it should be able to beat the rest of the market, and we should be able to kick ass, and we should be able to, you know, outperform the market with our investments. So my argument would always be, let's not underplay what we can achieve. Let's be better than the unsustainable brands. Let's be more efficient than the dodgy sweatshops, and more productive, and produce higher quality garments with better margins and so on. And that's really what investors are looking for. They're looking for really professional, kick-ass businesses that are leveraging these sustainability trends, but are actually better than the average.
I actually also want to know your take on that specifically, and I want just to add a follow-up question for you too, because it is, yes, about, specifically in the ethical fashion space, about making things look beautiful. But with making them look beautiful, it also comes a concern about quality. Specifically, for example, I don't know, Spenna, who's dealing with artisans, right? Who's dealing with artisans that can have their own traditional techniques that they've been passed through generations, but at the same time, how can you ensure that across the board there's like a quality standard? In the same way that you're going to be, you're dealing with individuals who haven't had the, I don't know, like maybe they have had enough preparation in order to be able to develop this high quality textiles or not, and then how do you actually ensure your customer that they're getting what they're paying for, basically?
Yeah, sure. So the way that we have sort of found the cooperatives and the communities that we work with are through larger national organizations. So in India, there is something called Daskari Hat Samiti, which is an association of craftspeople. In Mexico and in Indonesia, they also have similar organizations. And so they have really worked with these communities for a long time and done a lot of capacity building and training to ensure that their production methods are up to par with global quality standards. And I think that in the long term, like Carlos mentioned, we're a very new company, but in the long term, a vision that I see for Sira is to expand to more communities that may not be under these umbrellas, and utilize the capacities of other NGOs and organizations to actually bring into the fold these communities so that they can also access the global demand and produce products that are of the same quality.
What about you, Christian?
Yeah, I mean, going back to what James said, we very much follow the Tesla model. We went after the luxury market first. We said, we're going to make the best t-shirt that we possibly can. We're going to get the luxury consumers, the athletes, the celebrities on board first, because that's the group that the rest of the industry follows. And I think it's really important to start with being cool or sexy or whatever it is, because that's what we need to get a larger audience on board. As far as quality goes, I mean, in many ways, when we're talking to that group of luxury consumers, we downplay the fact that we're hiring people out of prison because there is some skepticism that they will have the skills that they need to produce at the level that justifies their price point. And what I can say is that, so we have this side vent on our t-shirt that allows it to drape well with a slightly longer fit, and there's, I've looked at maybe 100 to 200 ways that those can possibly be constructed, and we picked the one that we thought had the greatest durability and looked the best on the inside and out. And then we had Aaron, who had sewed for 18 months in prison and then got out and started working for us. He spent nearly 3 months basically just sewing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of side vents, because we said we're never going to compromise on quality. Like, that's not an option. So it's been investing a lot of money that probably should have gone toward building our brand into building our production, but we said that's a non-negotiable. So we have very high standards ourselves for that.
So if I can just coming back to that question, I also don't want people to think that the only way an ethical fashion brand can survive is to be really expensive, because it doesn't need to be. And flipping back to sort of the Gap and H&M, it is absolutely possible for these large brands to produce ethically and sustainably in countries like Bangladesh and deliver you clothes that are, very cheap. So what we're doing in the factories is we're saying we can provide the same price point as the lesser quality factories, but the way we do that is through working really hard to improve the productivity of the workers. So if you can improve productivity in a Bangladeshi factory by 30 to 50%, which is absolutely possible, the difference between the best factories in the world and the average factory in Bangladesh is probably 5 to 10 times in terms of productivity. I mean, it's extraordinary. A lot of these factories they don't have any software involved. It's just whiteboards. The production is done in the head of the production manager. There's no industrial engineering. There's no decent accounting systems. They're paying their workers by cash. It takes 5 days to distribute the payroll. They have staff turnover of 10% a month. So our first proposed deal is about a 7,000 person factory. Imagine having 700 people coming and going every single month who you have to train. And then you expect them to get optimization of industrial processes. It just doesn't happen. So you end up with this really low-end, simplified processes where you have 90 people to do one button-down shirt, whereas the most efficient factories in Sri Lanka do the same with 40 people at twice or 3 times the speed with far fewer mistakes at a much higher quality. So if we can work with these lower-end factories to improve productivity, we can deliver higher wages, we can deliver healthcare programs, microfinance programs, all kinds of improvements in these factories. At the same time, we are delivering garments at a competitive price point to what Gap or H&M could buy them from your average factory. So it's absolutely possible to produce ethical clothing that is also at a more like a fast fashion price point. That's a very separate question from, if you are an ethical fashion brand, what's your best strategy to bring your startup up?
Yeah, I mean, we often have to differentiate the difference between, or spell out the difference between a luxury good and a sustainable and an ethically produced good. We've chosen to do both. That doesn't mean that you have to. And I think there's a lot of confusion when people assume that what we're selling is, marketed at the traditional consumer base that's buying sustainable and ethical clothing, and it's not. It's at a different one. We're looking at what does it look like to bring that price point down by 4 times, and I think it's possible. You're paying for the materials and the construction right now, not necessarily just the ethics and sustainability. But I would also, in a counterpoint to what you're talking about, I think there's a big conversation about how cheap stuff should be, and about the way that this method of basically constant consumption drives problems outside of just labor abuses in terms of climate change and what are, the idea that we should have as much stuff as we want. I personally don't think we have a right to a lot of stuff. I think we have a right to stuff that's made ethically and fairly. and kind of that. I think there's a larger discussion around what stuff should cost and how much stuff should we have and how price plays into that.
Yeah, look, this is a really good debate to have because, you know, even if you bring a Bangladeshi factory to fair trade standards, of course they're going to have low wages. But I don't see that as a problem. I see that as perfectly ethical to have the poorest people in the world on low wages making clothes, and we're paying them to do that, and we're providing jobs which eventually get them out of that. So even if the industry was made as ethical as, say, the leading factories in Sri Lanka, it would still be dirt cheap. And I think that's okay, because think about how much less poor Americans pay for their clothes than what they did a generation ago. Clothes are so cheap for the poorest in the world, and the poorest Bangladeshis themselves actually can buy clothes that are super cheap. So remember that the people who are paying, many of them are also poor. So I think as long as they're produced ethically, that's fine. Now, I think fast fashion has been absolutely fantastic for the world's poor. I think it's been an environmental disaster. And that's something that people don't really talk about. People kind of automatically assume fast fashion's bad for people. Actually, it's not. It's created unbelievable number of jobs. Now, not all of them are ethical jobs and so on, but it has generated and pumped so much money because everyone still has to stitch fast fashion, even if it's low quality. Someone still is sewing it, and there's a damn lot more sewing going on because of fast fashion. Tens of millions of jobs have been created. But it's an environmental disaster. And that's where, from a big picture perspective, it's inexcusable. The overconsumption, I think, is more of an environmental issue. But that overconsumption is actually pretty good for the world's poor who's actually stitching these clothes.
Sorry, one more thing. I mean, this is basically a debate on globalization, really, in many ways. Like, fashion is a lens in which we can look at these bigger problems and say, you know, we can do things ethically in another place. I mean, part of my research at Princeton was on looking at kind of the causes of the rise in the prison population, and one of the things you see is a very strong correlation between jobs being shipped overseas in chases of cheap prices and cheap labor, and how that led to crime or poverty, which leads to crime, which leads to incarceration at the same time that we were introducing the war on drugs and 3 strikes you're out and mandatory sentencing, and kind of this bigger debate of, okay, we can do this and it may work out for some things, but how do we feel about how that impacts us here versus, you know, and I think we'll get into this, but like jobs locally versus jobs in Bangladesh versus, you know, one good job here versus 100 good jobs there, like how we value that stuff.
But this is a debate that's really worth having, because I feel like in the ethical fashion space, the localism piece and made in the USA and made locally is such a big strand of conversation, and I'm not even American, right? So why would I care if something's made in America? It makes no sense to me whatsoever to say that something is more ethical because it's made down the road than made by Bangladeshis who actually really, really need the work. And, you know, I feel emotionally connected to the localism thing, right? I like it. I love the food miles and stuff. Emotionally appeals, but when you put it to intellectual scrutiny, and again, as somebody from a part of the world that exports huge amounts of food, I know the New Zealanders get really pissed off with people in Britain saying, oh, let's make our cheese in England, it's so much more sustainable. Actually, no, shipping cheese from New Zealand, given how efficient New Zealand is for rainfall and fertile land and so on, if you do a full life cycle assessment of cheese, it's actually more environmentally friendly to ship it from New Zealand to England than to make it in England with these highly subsidized cows that are just, a total waste of taxpayers' money. But I think this globalization question is really important, and let's have the debate and let's really, bring it on.
No, definitely. I think it's a really important debate to have, and I would actually like to hear the voice of our third panelist on what she believes is important when crafting the mission of an ethical fashion firm in this way. There are consumers, for example, if you are trying to appeal to the American market, to the US market, most of your consumers, or some of your consumers, are definitely going to be more carried away with the Made in America brand more than we're trying to leverage the skill set of people in emerging economies, for example. So how do you see that combination playing out? And do you think that it's important to strike the right balance between the made in America ethical fashion companies and the ones that work offshore, trying to offshore these services? Or?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we really value the communities that we work with. And because we work with two distinct communities, the designers and the artisans, we want to make sure that we are supporting both of those communities. So with the artisans, of course, by sourcing from them and providing them with increased demand and helping them build their capacities and skills, we are investing in those communities. Sira does manufacture in the United States. I definitely see the value of producing in both places. I think both of you outlined those pretty well. There's a social and economic incentive to both of them. But we produce in the United States because we also believe, sort of like James was talking about, that it's important to stimulate the economy. And with the whole history of the garment district in New York, I think that that's something that we definitely are interested in investing in. And so as Sira is also based in the United States, that's something that we also value.
Great. And shifting gears just a bit, we're interested, James, in trying to understand a bit more how, yes, it's all about, again, making things beautiful, and it's all, again, about appealing to the consumer. But there's a whole logistical infrastructure behind actually creating and crafting a product. And we are wondering if you can shed some light on how to keep a certain method of accountability, for example, when you're working with these factories in Bangladesh and trying to see, okay, if they're actually going to improve their processes, how to actually make them stick to their word and actually make this an improvement.
So the way we see creating impact and positive sustainability and ethics in these factories is really three layers. It's like a pyramid. There's the compliance layer, and as a private equity firm, we get to put somebody on the board, we get to hire the head of sustainability and really embed ourselves in that firm with full transparency. So we know if there's illegal overtime, we know if there's unauthorized subcontracting, we can put sensors on the water outflows to make sure there's no pollution going into the river. So as an investment firm, it allows us to get that compliance piece sorted. The middle layer is what we call strategic sustainability initiatives, which are everything that drives profitability and positive impact. And that could include anything around productivity, because productivity in these factories allows you to increase wages, it allows you to reduce staff turnover you have to reduce in order to increase productivity. Productivity drives margins because you can do higher quality garments and so on. And the great thing about focusing on productivity in these factories is that once you've increased productivity, you have to pay people more, because if you don't, they'll leave because they are the most skilled people in their local economy. And while there's some slavery in some parts of some supply chains, I tell you, in the export garment industry, it is the most efficient labor market you can ever imagine. If somebody gets one more cent a day next door, they'll just leave and go. And that's why you have 10% staff turnover a month, because people are just coming and going all of the time. And so that's really important, driving those productivity improvements. And healthcare is another big one. So poor health outcomes really drives absenteeism within these factories. As I said, 10% turnover a month, huge absenteeism from people getting sick. Many of the Bangladeshi factory workers have some kinds of parasites, so deworming programs can increase productivity tremendously. Many have anemia, many don't have menstrual solutions, so some garment factories have introduced free menstrual pads, and this has dramatically reduced absenteeism as well. So there are a whole range of ways that you can drive profitability through improving the lives of the workers. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid is really these partnerships where you can look at a garment factory as a piece of development infrastructure and say, well, we've got a payroll, we've got a communications ability, we've got a health clinic. Let's leverage these and bring in partners who are trying to do good for these communities and provide a piece of infrastructure where they can do that good far more efficiently than they could having community health centers and so on. So we're partnering with Johnson & Johnson to roll out a trial in healthcare around deworming and tuberculosis and all kinds of interventions, partnering with GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, to run prenatal nutrition, BRAC, the large NGO in Bangladesh, to do clinic births, and we figure if we can get the garment workers really healthy and get the prenatal piece and the clinic birth and the postnatal and breastfeeding and all of that kind of thing sorted, then that is a massive contribution to what we're doing. And we can do that, we believe, while staying competitive in the market.
I was going to ask you a question. So I recently talked with a factory owner from Pakistan who said, he had introduced some level of water treatment coming out of his factory because the companies he was working with had mandated it, but it wasn't the level that they would like, and it was also getting poured right back into the dirty water that was exiting the other factories. One of his frustrations or challenges was, what does it take to get the investment community to invest in the infrastructure that one factory owner is never going to be able to do, but like whether it's a water treatment center within a community that the factory owners themselves aren't able to do, and they haven't seen a lot of brands willing to do this. Where do you think that next step is in getting some of the more infrastructure level projects on board beyond the wage and
So for issues like environmental issues, particularly water pollution, it's a tragedy of the commons situation. So there's a couple of solutions. Firstly, you can do what Patagonia and H&M increasingly and other brands are doing, which is just saying, we will not source unless you've got monitoring and so on. The Chinese government has done a really good job of just regulating water pollution. Now, they haven't finished that job by any means, but they are starting to put sensors, remote sensors that are very difficult to tamper with and get around on the outflows of dye houses in China, and I think that's dramatically improved the situation. I think the brands, there are some really good initiatives around water pollution, but they're still patchy. I think pressure from the leading brands on the manufacturers is hugely important. Pressure on the leading brands on the industry associations. So the Bangladesh Garment Industry Exporters Association is a very powerful association. Half of their members are in parliament. The brands need to put direct pressure on the industry associations to, agree to have these kind of standards. The standards in Bangladesh are significantly lower than even in India. And so, this is a tragedy of the commons problem. This is a policy thing. It's very difficult for one factory to go, oh, we're going to put reverse osmosis on every single one of our water treatment and then charge, the same price. It's not going to work. So absolutely, that needs to be a policy level solution.
Definitely. And again, shifting gears a bit to the importance of building long-term relationships with your customers, being an ethical fashion brand. I wanted to ask Christian, how do you see yourself and Laslo trying to achieve this in the long term? How are you going to make your customers come back, not only because of quality, but because again they believe in your mission? So what is the importance in differentiating yourself, especially when again the space is a bit overcrowded from the perspective of companies, not investment, but companies?
I think it starts with a great product that people love, and then I think there's a whole lot of questions. I think brands that inspire great loyalty are very authentic. They're very open about what they're doing, following through on what we say we're going to do. So if we say we're going to work with people in Detroit and then we're running and getting some of our stuff made in sweatshops elsewhere, that doesn't make sense. One of the conversations we're having a lot internally right now is how much is the Detroit and the job creation the core of our story versus our approach to business. And in terms of sourcing fabrics, a lot of the fabrics that I would like to work with we just can't find in the States or we can't find sustainably, and how do we either partner with brands that are doing it or what are the compromises that we make, because you're not going to be an uncompromised company forever. And so how do we value each of those pieces? And then I think being very honest and being willing to share about how we do that, both to other brands and to our customers, I think is what people are attracted to. I think that within the industry right now, people email us all the time and are like, where'd you get your fabric? Where'd you learn, where'd you hire from? All of those questions. And my initial response is like, oh, I don't want to tell them. Like, I'm a very competitive person. I don't want to give away any of our secrets, but I think that moving forward, the brands that are successful with building customer loyalty and also with moving the industry along as a whole are going to be the ones that are willing to share, whether it's open sourcing or whatever it is. I think that's such an important part because this is a space that has so much room to grow. Like this is all boats float with a rising tide right now. There's not we're not constrained by the market size. There's a lot of room for us to do this well.
Definitely. And coming back a bit to the risk that is faced by, for example, investors that want to get into the ethical fashion realm and that don't have any prior experience to it, but they're interested in it because they see it as a growing market. For example, James, what are some ways that you see that these investors can mitigate the risk of getting into the space, especially when you're dealing with early stage ventures?
So early stage VC is a very high risk investment strategy for anybody. And I would recommend, if somebody's interested in ethical fashion, first of all, recognize that on the retail side, it's probably a higher risk than any other VC you will ever have. I mean, it's like investing in a Manhattan restaurant. I mean, you know how many fashion brands go out of business in restaurants in Manhattan. It makes no sense whatsoever from a purely rational perspective. That said, really good VCs succeed, right? And it's all about domain expertise, right? Domain expertise and understanding the space, understanding the markets, and it's a people business. Great entrepreneurs are great entrepreneurs, and they're pretty hard to pick. Now, the venture capital industry overall has had pretty appalling financial results, and to the point where some pension funds just won't invest in VC, period, because they're just like, well, why would we invest in VC when we just can't make any money out of it, and other asset classes are just easier. That said, it's really exciting. It's really fun. And if you are a high net worth individual and you want to back a business, then go for it. That's awesome. And there are some specialist investors like the Quarters Foundation who I would recommend anybody interested in investing in this space. There's a very small community of people who are building up that domain expertise. Really, that's the key. You need to understand what the hell you're doing, and that takes time. You can co-invest with people like Quarters and others, and then go tippy-toe into that.
I would also say from the other side, trying to raise money, some of the questions we've come across or some of the challenges we've come across is there's not at least the way that we're building it, there's not a level of scalability that you might see in a lot of other industries that the VCs are investing in. So you're constrained by production, you're constrained by the very challenging retail market. I mean, for us, we're setting up our own manufacturing. Manufacturing is not something that's necessarily hot right now, although I think it's a great tool for job creation. I think we have to find ways to leverage perhaps new technologies plus manufacturing, or figuring out some way to get over some of those larger barriers to entry to getting up and running for some of these brands than you might see in the tech space.
Just to jump in, where I think there are some really interesting opportunities is in the sustainable fabric tech space. So these are really environmental technology companies, right? They're not ethical, they're not fashion companies, but they're producing new types of fabric, new types of processes. The developments in the dyeing process is incredible. Waterless dyes, these kind of things. Automation is pretty scary. I've heard some podcasts recently about, now they've got robots that are starting to make clothing, which certainly is scary for the 7 million Bangladeshi garment workers. But there's some really interesting technologies, and these are purely tech plays, right? Not fashion plays.
And I would just add that one of the challenges that we faced when we were trying to raise capital is that investors usually in this space don't want to invest in you unless you see traction. But of course, retail is very expensive and capital intensive. So how do you create that traction if you don't have money from before? So it's a really big paradox in the industry.
Well, definitely. And as long as we would like to keep this conversation going, we want to open the panel for Q&A because we're really interested in what you have to say and the questions that you have for our panelists. So are there any questions that you would like to ask?
I understand that a lot of the environmental...
I think they're coming forth. Yeah, thanks.
I understand that a lot of the environmental impact also happens on the consumer side in terms of the frequency of washing and the frequency of purchasing clothing. And I know that some companies like Patagonia are getting involved in the consumer behavior piece and trying to convince them not to buy as much, but this obviously has a financial impact for the company as well. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, should companies be, like, especially smaller companies, be getting involved in the consumer behavior piece? And if so, how can they navigate the trade-off between environmental sustainability and financial health?
I think first, make great products that cost more, but you need to sell fewer of, is a starting point. I think in the industry, there's kind of perhaps two camps. One is technology will have to save us in terms of new manufacturing processes and fabrics because it's impossible to change consumer behavior. And I think the other camp is perhaps consumer behavior has to change us because we've never figured out how to make anything sustainably. And I think there's finding some balance between those two is really important. But I think any brand that says they're about sustainability and isn't addressing the fact that we consume way too much stuff is not addressing the issue completely.
James, Bandy, any takes? Any other gentlemen?
Hi, this is Josh Humphreys from Croatan Institute. James and I are completely solidaristic on the global engagement, shareholder activism with the multinationals. I wanted to make a comment in guise of a question, though, on the globalization debate, which I found really fascinating. And the basic question is, so how do we invest in the re-emergent value chains around textiles globally? And I don't think you have to be an American or a nationalist to value the re-emergent value chains in textiles. I'm from North Carolina. And I'm in, the central part of the state, the Piedmont, traditional textile bastion, because it's in the South. Sven Beckert in his book on the Empire of Cotton described the U.S. South as part of the global South, which seemed a little odd, because all the displacement of the textile manufacturing base in the region because of NAFTA and CAFTA and globalization, right? So these communities that were really traditionally dependent upon textiles have been socially decimated, right? And that has political consequences in purple states like the U.S., because basically industries that were really robust in the 90s in this region now are actually the sources of neo-Confederate protests, the Trump and proletariat, so to speak. And I think that actually has global consequences for people like you who have a cosmopolitan view. So it's not out of nostalgia, it's out of a kind of communitarian sense of importance that there are places where you can have a very low environmental footprint if you're in an area like North Carolina where you can actually grow cotton and you can have a dirt-to-shirt supply chain holistically within the space of 250 to 500 miles. And that actually is happening with B Corps, with co-ops, and those companies need our support. For the same, I think, cosmopolitan, ethical imperative that you describe globally, and I think we can do both. And I think that's sort of my question. So how do we do both across asset classes and diversified portfolios? Maybe we can do it as shareholder activists, as microfinance investors, but can we also support B Corps and cooperative models, not necessarily because they're in the US, but because they're doing really important things in the whole world for all of us?
So I think the assumption is that some kind of more, whether it be protectionism or more government involvement or subsidization of industries so that people don't get as badly hurt is a solution. As in Australia, we basically have no tariffs on anything, no agricultural tariffs and so on. We've locked up huge chunks of national park, so some of those logging communities have been decimated. Of course, our apparel and footwear industries are just totally wiped out. But like the United States, Australia has unemployment of less than 5%. Now, yes, there are, especially because of the rise of China in the 90s, there was a subset of, working class men mostly in the United States who did get hurt from that, but others benefited as well. And the interesting thing about the Trump phenomena is it doesn't matter whether the industry itself was hurt by globalization or actually is currently a beneficiary of globalization. In those parts of the country that support Trump, it's the same rate, whether they're from an industry that was hurt or harmed. And there's some really counterintuitive statistics around the Trump phenomenon. And I'm not convinced that sort of picking one industry to back to regenerate, is necessarily because of a historical connection to that industry makes any sense at all. I think what...
It's happening regardless of history.
Yeah.
It's happening anyway. There's a Carolina textless history.
Yeah.
So it's happening despite globalization. So how do we support that despite the policies?
I would say recognize that it's not all about economics and that there are a whole lot of other value, there is a lot of other value created. So for example, right now, as we move toward a more globalized creative community, you see that everyone is looking at whether it's the same Instagrams or they're getting fabrics made in the same places or clothing made in the same factories, and you're losing a lot of the regional and creative distinction that comes with pulling from all parts of the globe. So I think saying there's a lot of value to, even a t-shirt made in Detroit versus a t-shirt made in California, like saying, what are the benefits and creative side of things that come out of being in a place-based system, and how can we support that? So I would say getting outside of purely the economics and saying there's a whole lot of values that are created by doing these things regionally or locally beyond what we perhaps typically look at.
Great, and we have space for one more question, so please. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm very interested in how to create ethical companies to support job creation, specifically for youth, for vulnerable youth and vulnerable communities in the developing world. So I was just interested, for both of you have started companies, what's your advice for how to manage your human resources so that it's not only about getting a paycheck, but it's about creating valuable work experiences that they can use throughout their life?
Sure. So one thing that I would really stress is that if you want to enter this space and work with a particular community, you have to really understand the community. When you enter the space, especially when we entered the space, there's so many companies that do essentially the same thing that it's really easy to think that there's only one very large problem. But once you actually start listening to your communities, you'll begin to understand why other brands have failed to support those communities, why those communities may have failed to enter the global economy and succeed with those brands, and what the supplementary resources those brands need in order for your impact to actually be a lasting one. In some communities we've worked with, it was financial literacy. In some communities it was the fact that women are not respected enough to really be considered the producers and the earners of money. So I would really emphasize that no matter what community you work with, you need to listen to them.
What's your take?
Yeah, that.
Great. Well, we have 1 minute left. If there are no other further questions, we really thank you all for showing up today. We hope that you enjoy the weekend and that you've learned a bit more about what are the current trends in ethical fashion. Thank you so much, everyone.